It is really wonderful to see so many friends, colleagues, and family members on this webinar call. Welcome to Wellness in the Time of COVID-19, Essential Practices from the Perspective of Two Black Women Physicians. Produced by Rochelle Faithful, Esquire, folk healer, and one of the visionary leaders setting direction and realizing programs for our work in support of helpers and healers. Today, we welcome two outstanding Black women doctors who are here to share some of their perspectives and practices for well-being for the whole person in this time of the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disproportionately impacted Black and Brown communities, immigrants, and poor folk everywhere. Our honored guests today are Dr. Rahma Kutua and Dr. Qadira Ali Huff. Please allow me to share a little bit about them. Dr. Kutua was born into a Tanzanian family and raised in Botswana. She received her BA in psychology from Harvard and earned her MD from Mount Sinai in New York City. Since finishing her pediatrics residency in the community health track at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., she has worked as a community pediatrician in Los Angeles and Washington, D.C., where she now lives and works. She has strong interest in global and public health and believes that high-quality, empathic healthcare is a universal human right. She has done work in improving healthcare infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa and is passionate about education of patients, healthcare professionals in training, as well as peers. She is newly interested in learning more about how best to mitigate the effects of adverse childhood experiences on one's future health and how to cultivate resilience, mindfulness, and promote true well-being in the populations she serves and amongst her trainees and fellow providers. In her spare time, Dr. Kutua enjoys writing poetry, traveling, and watching science fiction movies. Dr. Qadira Ali Huff is a double board certified physician in pediatrics and lifestyle medicine. Maybe we'll have to get you to explain to us what this means to be double board certified.
Love it.
She completed her medical training at the University of Maryland School of Medicine and Pediatrics residency at Children's National Hospital. She also completed a Master of Public Health in Policy with a research focus on food systems and health disparities at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health. She integrates lifestyle medicine into every visit by coaching families on how to build healthy foundations through physical activity, nutrition, stress management, and other strategies. Dr. Huff is a member of the American College of Lifestyle Medicine, a founder of the Hyattsville, Maryland chapter of Walk with the Doc, a community-based walking program designed to encourage physical activity and to promote health literacy. Dr. Huff serves on the board of Maryland Mentor and Center DC and lives in Maryland with her husband and 2 daughters. She enjoys traveling, riding her Peloton, and cooking new plant-based recipes. Her business, Sprouting Wellness, supports families along the journey towards adopting healthier lifestyles. Again, thank you both for being with us, and thank you all for being with us. physician wellness is an area of long-term interest for me by virtue of my own work as PI for the William and Mary Eastern Virginia Medical School Narrative Medicine for Excellence project and my volunteer work with the fundamental role of the Arts and Humanities in Medicine initiative of the Association of American Medical Colleges, which I have been a part of now for more than 3 years. These are both programs designed to improve physician well-being, among other things. Dr. Katua, let's start with you, as I've known you the longest. Together, you and Dr. Ali wrote the blurb for today's meeting. The practice of medicine is inherently stressful. However, for physicians who are also members of historically underrepresented groups in medicine, these inherent stressors can often be magnified. Add on a pandemic, especially one that disproportionately affects the very communities to which these physicians belong, and we may have the perfect storm for a crisis in wellness. So again, Dr. Katua, we've known each other about 3 years, first through my work as a consulting minister at All Souls Church in DC, and later you took a Braxton Institute, Volunteers of America, and the LA County Department of Mental Health 10-hour training on transforming moral injury across the professions, cultivating moral resilience through reflective writing and contemplative practice, which I co-taught with my colleague, Cinda Rushton, in Los Angeles around this time last year. I was so delighted that you accepted our invitation to do today's webinar and that you encouraged your colleague, Dr. Huff, to join us as well. So you've put together a brief presentation. And after that, I'll ask you a question to be followed by one or two from the chat box. Then Dr. Huff will speak and I will follow both with questions from the chat box, then some open dialogue from the two of you. And finally, you'll recap by sharing with us a short list of essential self-care habits that you recommend everyone explore for their own wellness toolkit. So here we are, all framed up.
Okay. Thank you so much, Reverend Braxton, for that amazing introduction. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes? Yes? Okay, perfect. So I thought that I would start just by telling you guys a little bit about my story, how I came to be this Black doctor, and just kind of walk you along my path and kind of my passions and my thoughts, and just my reflections on what's been going on right now and how that feels. And so just forgive me, I've written down some of my thoughts. There was so much I wanted to discuss today, so I've tried to focus it a little bit better. So I may glance down at my thoughts from time to time. So I was born in Botswana. My family is Tanzanian. I knew that I wanted to be a doctor when I was 8 years old. And I also knew that I would have to leave my home country to do that. There were no medical schools in Botswana when I was growing up. And I think when I hit secondary school, it really hit me that, oh, if I really want to pursue this, I can't do this here. My older brother paved the way for me in terms of moving to America. I followed him very shortly thereafter. I won a scholarship to go to a small boarding school in Western Massachusetts. And to be honest, that was my first kind of encounter and grappling with the American brand of racism. We had our own post-colonial racism that we had dealt with back in the motherland. So in any case, you know, I did my postgraduate year of high school, and then I went on to Harvard, majored in psychology, was pre-med. I had a brief stint as a science teacher in the Middle East for 2 years, high school science teacher, and then I came back to America to pursue medicine. And so, you know, now that my years of formal training are behind me, I find that my ethos and the way I practice medicine has kind of evolved as my own personal journey has evolved as well. So I have developed this really deep desire, largely secondary to how I have felt at times as a Black woman, as an immigrant. I have oftentimes felt invisible, undervalued, and it's really fueled in me this desire to create spaces where people feel seen and heard and valued, in the hopes that that would help facilitate their own growth and transformation. And so, as you can imagine, pouring that kind of emotional energy and love into your work, kind of day after day, can be emotionally taxing. It is not lost on me the immense privilege that I have as a physician. People come to me with their deepest fears and insecurities. Oftentimes they'll say things to me like, I have never said this to anybody before, and they'll lay out something that's very painful, very challenging. And it's my job to receive that in a loving way and help in whatever way I can. And sometimes, frankly, I'm a community pediatrician and the extent of my patients' problems are often beyond me. But I have found the power of just sitting there with them in that moment has been just profoundly healing, not just for them, but for myself as well. And so in light of who I am as a human being and the type of physician I strive to be, the question that I've been asking myself more and more is, what does it look like to bring my whole self to my work and still maintain enough boundaries to remain professional and to feel safe, especially because being Black and being female in medicine, it hasn't always felt safe. Voicing my doubts, voicing my anxieties or my insecurities hasn't always been modeled, and it hasn't always felt safe either. And, in modern culture and all of these TV shows, you kind of get this impression that physicians are all knowing, all sacrificing superheroes. You forget that we are, at the end of the day, humans taking care of other humans. This year, more than ever, it's been so hard for me to continue to compartmentalize my identities, which I've had to do in the past in order to survive. But I find myself now, June 2020, grappling with the fact that I am Black and a physician. I am a woman and a physician. I am an immigrant and a physician. So I feel the joy and pain and the weight of all of those identities coming together, and I carry those with me into every patient encounter, for better or for worse. And so what does this look like for me in the time of COVID-19? We all know that this pandemic is unprecedented, and the ways in which it has exacerbated or brought into the light these deep and painful disparities between different groups has been really hard to see on a daily basis. It's been especially painful for me as a Black person to hear people speculate on, communities of color are disproportionately affected because of poor lifestyle choices or pre-existing conditions alone, things that don't take into account centuries of systemic racism and disenfranchisement, and just the lack of social determinants of health and the impact that that has. So again, I work at a community health center in DC. DC is increasingly gentrified. So I literally, because of the patients I take care of patients on Medicaid and private payer. My patients right now are a large mix of different things. I have immigrant patients, I have patients of color, Black patients. I have a lot of white affluent patients, actually for the first time in my career, in my current job. And because COVID-19, we've had to do kind of unprecedented things. We've really ramped up our work, for example, in telemedicine. I am in people's homes in ways I have never been before. And so I see these disparities kind of unfolding before my eyes. So just anecdotally, just in my current experience, my white patients have tended to be largely in single family homes, largely able to work from home, largely able to maintain their jobs. My Black and Latinx patients, for the most part, have tended to live in multiple generational homes with multiple generations. Their parents have been working. They've been doing lower income essential jobs, cashiers, grocery store workers, transportation workers, sanitation workers. They've also been more likely to become unemployed. And so watching this pandemic unfold and seeing the faces that look like yours suffering has really, for lack of a better expression, left me somewhat shook. I had a video visit with a Latinx father a few weeks ago, It was a routine asthma follow-up visit. And he, in the video, was sitting about 20 feet away from his son. And I didn't understand. It seemed like excessive social distancing to me. And I asked him, you know, Dad, what's going on? You know, why are you sitting so far away from your son? And he said, oh, doctor, we've already lost 3 family members to COVID. So I'm being extra careful. And I was speechless for a full minute. I just couldn't imagine such loss. And so that's been really hard to see. And so, you know, you talk about all of these forces, the fact that I'm still a human being taking care of other humans. You know, the practice of medicine is inherently stressful. You're trying to take care of people. You're trying to take care of people quickly. You're trying to not make mistakes. You're trying to make people feel seen and heard and valued, all of which takes time. And then on the flip side, you have the pressures from COVID-19 itself. I can say, and I'm still fairly young in my career, but I've never experienced a situation where I'm also concerned about my personal health and the health of my family and my loved ones. The first time I received a positive COVID-19 test for a patient I had swabbed myself, I remember looking at that test result on the computer screen and feeling as if I was crawling in COVID. I felt like I could not get clean enough because it was like this invisible enemy. And since then, I have lost count at the number of positive COVID tests I've been in contact with, but I continue to worry. You know, will I be this young person that succumbs? Will I be a statistic? And so, you know, that we can't take those personal fears lightly. And then you have the uncertainty of this virus. You know, people want answers. Parents ask me questions about coronavirus that I don't have answers to, that nobody has answers to. And that's very uncomfortable as a physician, to not have answers. We were trained to always have answers. So even saying, I don't know, I'm not sure, I'm sorry, you know, we're learning with you, it doesn't feel good. In my spirit as a doctor, it doesn't feel great. And, you know, so all of this is against the backdrop of all of the other things, all of the other stressors that go with just being who I am, being in this Black female body, practicing medicine. So, for example, I've experienced racism in medicine myself. I've witnessed racism in medicine directed at my patients. I've experienced sexism and sexual harassment. I have an ongoing battle with imposter syndrome and self-doubt. You know, I often worry and wonder, am I good enough? Am I smart enough? Am I enough? I struggle with moral distress. You know, I worry that I'm not able to do the things for my patients that they really need because of the limitations of the healthcare system in this country. The limited visits, this focus on revenue and this sliver of time I've given to be with people is really stressful for me. And with my Black patients especially, I worry if they leave me, when they leave me, if I don't have enough time to sit with them, who else will listen to them? Who else will they feel comfortable opening up to? For many patients of color, I'm the only Black physician they've ever seen. That was very prevalent for me, especially in my last job in California. And then I have compassion fatigue. I'm an empath. I absorb people's emotions and anxieties. And so seeing that, carrying the weight of that day in, day out, day after day has definitely taken a toll. And because of all of this, for me, self-care is an imperative. You know, I can't afford not to take care of myself, to continue to be present for my friends, my family, my fiance, and my patients. I need to take care of myself. And so, you know, a little bit later, we're gonna kind of touch on, you know, kind of our self-care, what we do, what Kadir and I do. But just to give you guys a brief sense of kind of my multi-pronged approach, when I'm spiraling, I kind of go back to basics. So I focus on my sleep, what I'm eating and movement. I lean on my authentic, loving network. I work on cultivating self-compassion. So really kind of treating myself like my own best friend, learning to hold my thoughts with love and tenderness. I really am a big fan of boundaries. I think there's no self-care without boundaries. As an empath, I have boundaries around what I will let a job do to me. I have boundaries around my personal time. I schedule me time for myself every week. And then I really try to take care of my mind and spirit. I'm a huge fan of therapy. I've had wonderful therapists over the years. And then I, I read a lot. I am a big fan of people like Brene Brown, Michael Singer, Parker Palmer. I try to have a daily spiritual practice as well. And so I'm sorry we're rushing through this. I hope I can get to expand on this a little bit more towards the end. But just to kind of give you a sense of my personal wellness toolkit that has been very intentional because, again, I need this to get from Monday to Tuesday. Thank you, guys.
That was wonderful. And I'm sorry you had to rush, but we let it go a little bit beyond what we had in our flow chart because it's so important. And thank you for sharing so deeply. We don't always get this information from behind the white coat line. So blessings. I think now, Dr. Huff, we can transition to you, and perhaps you will also touch on some of the inherent stressors facing doctors from historically underrepresented groups in medicine, like Black women doctors, for example, and how these forces are magnified by COVID-19, some of your recommendations for essential practices. But really anything you choose to share with us, those are just some things we'd like to hear from you on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Reverend Braxton, and also to my dear friend, Dr. Rahema Katua, for inviting me to be here today as a part of this conversation. Life has been at once very much slowed down in the midst of the pandemic, but also has become more intense in many ways. So I appreciate the opportunity tonight to really slow down and have a moment of introspection, which we don't get enough of. So as I begin, I just really want to emphasize that this conversation is extremely near and dear to my heart and personal. Practicing as a Black woman physician when we make up just 2% of the population of practicing physicians in the United States, it means that my identity as a Black woman physician has been at once a sense of a source of pride and accomplishment, but also all along the way, my race has been an emotional fault line to contend with, and it shows up in so many different ways through my practice as a physician, especially practicing in an area where it's predominantly African American and low income, where I have a sense of these are my people. I was actually born in DC, born and raised, and I was born to two community activist parents who came of age during the Black Power movement in the 70s, and they met on the campus of Howard University here in DC. And having them as parents, the seed for community engagement and involvement was planted very, very early on in my life. And the notion that of all things, having a sense of service to others and making sure your life is one of service was made it pretty much an imperative, and no real pre-requirements in terms of what area to focus on in terms of profession. Whatever you do, however, make sure that you're of service. And so I really took that to heart. And around the age of 7 or 8, when I first declared I want to be a doctor, I knew that I wanted to help people. And I also knew that what little I knew in terms of the place of Black folks in the fabric of America, I knew I really wanted to help the Black community and serve them and partner towards achieving better health. I didn't know how complicated that would be early on in life, but I definitely developed a more nuanced picture in terms of what was really required to attain good health very early as I learned about the social determinants of health. During my undergraduate at Brown, I had a mentor who did a very, very deep dive with me in terms of really unveiling all these different layers from, the built environment to the food landscape to racism and the political structure, how all of these forces really impacted health and created health. And it was so much bigger than the doctor-patient relationship that we as physicians, this is the plane that we exist on most of the time. But as I learned about these different layers of health, I definitely knew that that was where I wanted to focus in terms of practice, not just on the individual level, but always keeping an eye on the bigger picture. And I think that having that broader lens has made practicing in the era of COVID a little bit more daunting and poignant, to realize just how much work there is to be done to make sure we don't have a situation like this again, where you have such disproportionate burden falling on poor Black, brown communities. And so really thinking about the interconnections of race and place in education and politics and history, this plays out every day for me as I practice medicine. Just like Dr. Kadua, I am a primary care pediatrician. I work at a community health center in Ward 8 here in Washington, DC. And so as I mentioned, it's definitely predominantly African-American and low income. And just thinking about, as I've had experiences with patients up pre-COVID, the various obstacles to attaining good health, and then having the added layer of the pandemic really has, in a lot of ways, wreaked havoc, as we've all seen in the media, on already vulnerable communities. And so I wanted to share a few just very, very small snapshots in terms of scenarios that I've had with patients over the past few months. So what am I seeing in community practice right now amongst my patients? So I'm seeing families who are choosing between employment and protecting their families and themselves, recognizing that if they're the only ones with a steady paycheck, then they have the burden of showing up to a job where there's insufficient personal protective equipment, knowing that there's occupational hazard. As Dr. Katua mentioned, the preponderance of quote unquote essential jobs falling upon Black and brown communities, whether it's grocery store workers, fast food, other service industries, delivery, and recognizing that folks felt like there was no alternative to showing up to work. Thinking about families that I've worked with who have multi-generational households and relying on the elders in their family for childcare, and knowing that there's going to be some level of exposure potentially as other adults show up to work and then potentially bring coronavirus back home, and knowing that there's going to be increased risk of infection and mortality to elders. One family that was particularly poignant, they had been in a shelter for 5 years. They currently still live in a shelter, actually, and they had finally just had a voucher come through where they would be able to use to get more permanent housing. However, the pandemic hit, which meant that they were not able to look at permanent housing options because viewing was unpaused because of the pandemic, meaning that they were forced to remain in their shelter housing for an indefinite amount of time. Thinking about the inherent mistrust, well-founded historically, between Black and brown communities and the healthcare system, and what that might mean in terms of the next phase of this virus and the vaccine. Who will get the vaccine, who will not, and what that means in terms of ongoing risk of illness and death even. Another huge source of just complexity has been the impact on children in learning, and thinking about the digital divide and who has access to internet, who has access to the technology in terms of iPads and laptops, and recognizing that many of my young patients who are already very academically vulnerable are now at jeopardy of falling farther and farther behind, and what that means in terms of the trajectory of their lives and their own, like, essentially outlooks for attaining good health. You know, educational attainment is a huge part of that. So that's been also a huge source of challenge in the midst of the pandemic. Food insecurity has also been huge. Many of the patients I serve already were struggling and on the brink of food insecurity, and then having the safety net of school nutrition kind of yanked out. Although many schools have stepped up in more creative ways to ensure that families have access, that has been a huge challenge for many families, with really no end in sight as unemployment rates continue to increase in the light of the pandemic. And then lastly, the huge psychological toll, which in many ways is another pandemic in and of itself. A recent Washington Post poll I saw noted that 31% of Black Americans personally knew someone who had died from COVID-19 versus just 9% of white Americans. So just that psychological toll and sense of sadness and burden is a whole nother level in terms of toll of this pandemic on the families that I'm personally serving. And so when we hear about the higher rates of infection and serious illness and death from COVID-19 amongst Black Americans, we have to interpret it through this lens of the social determinants. And all too often we do see that the individual person being, fully in charge and autonomous of their health and wellness, that narrative is completely outdated and wrong. And we really need to be interpreting what we're seeing in terms of the differential effect of COVID-19 through these social determinants that both Dr. Katua and I have spoken about. And so these factors really are telling the real story behind health disparities, and also the need for us to focus really on that multi-level approach, not just focusing on the individual and what they're doing to maintain their health, but systems level, just as we're being challenged in this moment of racial awakening to look at the different levels of racism and how we really need to be quite intentional about how we dismantle that. So a lot of parallels happening in this moment of health crisis and also racial injustice crisis going on all at the same time. And so there has been a lot to grapple with over the last few months, really just taking in these stories and recognizing the limitations of what we're able to do, especially in the context of primary care, even in the best of settings, because I am fortunate enough to have social work support, and we have a medical legal partnership at my clinic where we can refer families who are having housing issues that are more acute or even educational issues. However, there are limits everywhere because the need is so great. And so as time has marched on, things have gotten very, very heavy from the point of practitioner, thinking about really what my patients are experiencing, and also feeling a little bit uncomfortable about my own sense of privilege, being part of the 2%, quote unquote, and recognizing that I don't struggle for food, I don't struggle for housing, I don't struggle for a lot of things, and really feeling a little bit uncomfortable initially in recognizing my own personal challenges here. And some of those challenges were already mentioned by my colleague, but thinking about workplace exposure, and that is such a real thing. I remember the high sense of anxiety I had the first day I showed up to a shift where we were starting to test in clinic, and just feeling very, very nervous and wondering if I was going to don and doff my PPE appropriately, and was I being adequate in terms of my hand hygiene, just all the different factors, thinking about, I don't want to bring this home. So that was a huge thing. And also simultaneously feeling like, as a pediatrician, are we really frontline enough when you compare to many of our emergency medicine colleagues? Thinking about the racial burden of having to explain where these health disparities are coming from. And I feel like that's a burden that many Black Americans experience in lots of different settings, in terms of having to explain away or be the spokesperson for your entire race. Having rapidly changing work expectations in our clinic, we really ramped up telemedicine extremely quickly. So the practice of medicine itself has changed in the blink of even a matter of weeks. And so that was a tremendous toll in terms of having to be quite nimble and flexible and wanting to do a good job, because we also hear about nationwide furloughs in many healthcare settings, where once healthcare was thought to be one of the most secure jobs, being a physician. But in the light of this pandemic, many physicians have been furloughed, and not wanting that to be my own fate. And so really wanting to ensure we're stepping up at work. And then speaking of stepping up, the added parental responsibilities. I have a young child at home, and that has been a whole nother level of stress and source of additional of work and responsibility at home. And so all these different factors combined, what I'm getting at home, at work, what I'm getting at home, things were really starting to crescendo about 4 weeks into the pandemic. And I realized I was starting to reel. And I also realized that I had really started to fall off from my core health and wellness habits. And for me, and I know we're going to go into a little bit more detail, it really started with having a mindset shift and going from a sense of being reactionary to proactively being accepting of what was, so that I was no longer resisting, like, this isn't happening, this is happening. Okay, so now how do we move forward? And so for me, moving forward meant reinstating my core wellness habits, which really started with making sure that I was managing my spirituality, and that means prayer for me, and also a daily mindfulness habit, meditation. I actually had the good fortune of getting a Peloton about a week or two before the statewide shutdowns happened, and so I had the ability to exercise relatively regularly. So that was something that I really, I clung to early on. Journaling, having a sense of release from the stresses of the day, that has been a profoundly therapeutic personal wellness habit that I was able to pick back up as times were getting more challenging. Having a great sleep routine, therapeutic support. As Dr. Katua mentioned, I'm a huge proponent of therapy in many different forms. And so that was very transformative as well. And really having the ability to connect with my network, even in the novel ways over Zoom and FaceTime, but really carving out that time to connect and not being completely disillusioned with us not being able to meet up in person. So I think that it all started with that mindset shift and realizing that this is what it was, and accepting and knowing that for sustainability, to show up as the best doctor I can be and wife and mom, that I really had to carve out the time to pour into myself. And it's a struggle, which we'll talk about ways of really integrating it to the context of a busy life, but it's absolutely critical and not optional in our line of work, in this moment especially. So I think at the end, we will talk about a little bit of a call to action to encourage everyone on the call to reconsider their own wellness toolkit, and the importance of doing that when we aren't in times of crisis and stress acutely, just because it's a lot harder to rally and to create something novel when your cortisol levels are quite high. So doing it when things are a little bit more relaxed longitudinally, so that you are able to fall back on it when you really, really need it in times of crisis. So with that, I'll pass the baton back to Dr. Braxton, Reverend.
Thank you so much, Dr. Huff, again, for going deeply, and even for exploring the question of being a parent, which I know is part of your ongoing conversation with Dr. Katua. Tremendously valuable conversation that reminds us that physicians are people too. So thank you again for sharing and reflecting in such a meaningful way. Thank you both. I see a question from Reverend Michelle Walsh, who cares deeply about these things. Very happy to see you here, Michelle. Michelle's question is this: how much processing across disciplines are you finding among service providers of the exposures to vicarious and secondary trauma, and the need to prioritize your personal self-care and communal care, including the added impact of structural racism? I hear you mention social work. I'm curious about that role in the interdisciplinary systems. So people are fighting back against racism and structural racism everywhere. It is a moment. But how would you answer that question?
I can
exposure to secondary trauma.
That's a fantastic question. And I think that interestingly, in this moment of racial awakening is what I call it, our hospital specifically has done a lot to step up to provide forums for us in healthcare, not just for the physicians, but for our entire hospital staff to share experiences and also to get support. And this has also been in light of a larger movement within our hospital system towards healthcare provider resilience and wellness in general. We have a pretty growing and robust physician wellness committee. And I'm saying physician, but really it's healthcare worker wellness, where our system has gone so far as to sponsoring meditation trainings for any interested hospital employee, which I've actually taken part of 3 times now, which has been fantastic. So I think that there is definitely a growing movement to providing holistic support to us as healthcare providers. And I think from having the town halls to actually financially supporting meditation and mindfulness training has been quite heartening to see.
Thank you. That's very, very helpful. I see another question, an interesting one, and I wonder how you'll respond to it. Are there steps we could take that you recommend to address the socioeconomic determinants that so affect your work and patients? What steps could we as individuals and members of various communities take?
Ooh, I'll take a stab at it, and then I'm really curious as to what Kadira would say. I think for me, it kind of all boils down to my answer. I think like a lot of Black people, I've been fielding a lot of, people have been reaching out to me in this time, which has been beautiful and also exhausting in terms of what can we do, how can we support you at a time like this. And I just say, make sure you're doing your work, make sure that the life that you lead is quote unquote a diverse life. Like, make sure the things that we care about in terms of diversity are reflected in the decisions that you make, in the people that you spend time with, in the places that you spend your money, in the causes that you are championing, in the people that you vote for. How does your lifestyle, your whole lifestyle reflect your values? Because I've been saying for a long time that, this dismantling of this system that was constructed, that is systemic racism, it's not a sprint, it's not even a marathon, it's a relay race. But for me, it's going to be brick by brick by brick. So we all have to do our parts. And even if that means around the dinner table, what questions are you talking about? Are you checking your friends and your family and your colleagues when you're saying things that, disturb you in your spirit, but maybe 2 years ago you wouldn't have said anything? Now is the time to be saying things. And so I just say going back to basics. If that means you need to Google a reading list and start there. Educate yourself. I've had to educate myself. I strive to be an ally with groups that I don't personally identify with. I have to educate myself too. And so I think for me, that's kind of where it starts, and then just trying to have it reflected in your life.
Yeah, I think that that's a fantastic answer. I think awareness is key. That's the first step. And the fact that we are in this moment and we're all being pushed to have that moment of self-analysis, and also to put our critical lenses on as we interpret the world around us. I think that this is a view and a glimpse that we can never unsee. And I think that continuing the work day by day, and I agree with you, like having it show up in your daily life. I would say one additional thought, just in terms of we have to be vigilant in terms of how we make sense of the world around us. Because again, even in the context of these conversations about COVID-19 racial health disparities, there are many conversations we see on the news where the onus has been fully put on the individual, instead of, again, taking a step back and looking at all these different systemic layers that have contributed to the health disparities we see. They did not come out overnight. Just from a historical perspective, Blacks were brought to this country 1619 is the date commonly used. And so we have been post-Civil Rights Act for just 15% of that period of time between 1619 and now. That is a lot of time that, history and racism has had a chance to be entrenched and really infiltrate every aspect of life. And so I think, like Dr. Katua says, this is a lifelong journey, and this requires a high degree of vigilance. But I would say one way to keep yourself motivated is do the work in the areas that matter most to you. If you are into food, if you are into education, if you are into finances, do the work there. And that will, I think, motivate you to continue to dig deep in terms of all the different levels involved, because this is very deep, but we didn't get here overnight. So I think having that lifelong commitment is so key.
I love to hear you say, taking a moment to step back, to pause. Yeah. physicians and other clinicians, nurses, often aren't given time to absorb the trauma they witness. And so this becomes very important. I'd also like to suggest that the spiritual disciplines that you've outlined as a refuge and a sanctuary for yourself give you the best option for continuing morally resilient decision making. And I love what you said about practicing daily when you're not under stress, because you can't pull this up if you haven't practiced it. It's not in your toolkit if you don't do it on a daily basis. So if you want to be a morally resilient individual in society today, we have to be grounded. We have to ground ourselves in these practices. I'm so happy that you're bringing them to the fore. We'll start to wind down soon, but I see two more questions. One is from Christopher Lawton. Thank you, Christopher. I hear a lot of language right now about the dual pandemic, the first of COVID-19 and the second of racism. I've wondered about that language and what others think of it. Are there things you see in your work that you'd like to share about how we speak about this time? What language is helpful and what is not? Thank you, Christopher.
Thank you, Chris.
Yeah, that's a thinking question. That's very...
It is. You know, Q, did you want to speak?
You go first. You can go first.
Okay. So yeah, the first time I heard racism referred to as a pandemic, I was taken aback. And then it really, really sank in for me. I'm an immigrant and I grew up on the continent. Most of the people around me were Black, but I still experienced white supremacy. I still experienced racism. I grew up 30 minutes from the South African border. I was born before apartheid was dismantled. I remember watching Nelson Mandela be elected the first democratically elected president of South Africa. So we cannot escape this. This is prevalent worldwide. So to call it a pandemic, I think speaks to the public health crisis that it is, the moral crisis that it is, and the severity with which it affects our everything. You know, Kadir and I both have stories about the ways this has manifested in our lives, just even in all of the little obstacles we have had to jump through to become the 2%. You know, we don't even have time to unpack all of those.
That'll be another webinar.
So stay tuned, guys. And so, Chris, to answer your question, for me, I think that I like that term because I think it speaks to the depth of this problem. And I'm thankful that it's giving gravitas to something that many Black people and people of color have felt for a long time all around the world. I felt it growing up as a little kid in some far off country nobody has heard about. I feel it here in America. It looks different. It feels a little bit different, but it's shades of white supremacy. You know, it infuses everything.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said. I would perhaps just add thinking about how it's one pandemic of these structural levels of oppression, many of which are stemming from white supremacy and economic inequities that have resulted in the disparities along lines of COVID, but also these long, far-reaching racial disparities that we see. If you kind of tease apart what are those social determinants, they're really one and the same. And so I think that is a question that we'll continue to kind of tease apart, but I think the most important thing is that we're looking at both issues from a structural perspective. That's the most important thing to me right at this point.
And intersecting structures.
Yes.
Of oppression.
Yes.
Thank you all so much. We're running out of time. So I see a few more questions that we won't be able to address right now, but I heard somebody say another webinar. So I'm hopeful we'll be able to do this again in the fall or winter and bring back Dr. Katua and Dr. Huff. But for now, they want to share their recommendations for essential practices and recap for you what they have in their toolkits that might be helpful to you as well.
Perfect.
Yeah. Kadir, do you want to start?
Sure, I can start us off. So we each kind of already very briefly mentioned what was in our individual toolkit. So we will divide those topics up very quickly for you all. So one of the most important sources of stress relief and also grounding for me has been regular movement, really integrating that into, if not daily, close to daily practice. And I mentioned that I had the good fortune of getting my exercise bike just before the pandemic hit. And I found myself actually craving that sense of relief, and also knowing that this was my dedicated time outside of momming or doctoring. This was my time and my time alone. So I don't use the word exercise on purpose, just in terms of that can be a little bit alienating to some people, but finding something that brings you solace and makes your body feel good in terms of movement. Let that be walking or stretching or yoga or what have you, but something regularly, more days of the week than not, is very, very key and has been useful. Meditation and also prayer. So I think those are kind of two sides of my spiritual practice, has both been just extremely important in buoying my spirits and also stress relief. Meditation can come in a lot of different forms. It can just be mindful breathing, but it can actually, you can see the dividends very, very quickly. And there's a tremendous amount of research to support having a mindfulness practice. And so I would encourage that to be looked at in your wellness toolkit. And then lastly, I'll talk about mindful eating and the role of our diets and nutrition on our mental health as well. It's definitely a bi-directional relationship. A lot of times we think about our emotions fueling our eating, but our eating can actually either perpetrate or build up good emotions or more challenging ones. So trying to focus on fruits and veggies, a whole food, plant-based. It doesn't have to be vegan or vegetarian, but having fruits and vegetables and whole greens be the foundation of your plate. That really is food that's going to buoy your spirits, make you feel good. And also there's research to support that that's associated with a brighter affect and mental status. So that's great. And lastly, journaling. Some sort of creative force. And for me, it's journaling, but some sort of creative habit can also be tremendously valuable. So that's the down and nitty-gritty review.
I love it. And so just piggybacking off of that, I've had to become really intentional about cultivating self-compassion. I think when you are a type A physician and you've gritted your teeth and gotten through medical school and residency, you've gotten used to kind of having that harsh voice behind you, kind of telling you always, telling you what you're doing wrong, rarely what you're doing right. And so really learning to hold myself with love and self-compassion has been really important. One of the ways in which I've done that is just through educating myself. I'm a huge reader. I love thought leaders. I'm a huge fan of Brené Brown, as I mentioned earlier, and just also, going to therapy. So both of those things have kind of worked together for me to help me realize that I'm not my thoughts and help me work on deconstructing any self-limiting narratives I may have about myself because I'm a woman, because I'm an immigrant, because I'm Black, whatever the world would have had me believe about what I am capable of or who I am. And then, I touched on this a little bit earlier, developing and enforcing boundaries. Again, I think there's no self-care without boundaries. I was saying that I cannot show up for myself fully and for others around me if I'm not taking care of myself. One of the ways in which this has manifested for me, I'm only 4 years out from residency, but I have left jobs where I felt like I was not able to do things like have personal time, during the workday, have time to eat, have time to sit down, have time to go to the bathroom. When you're thinking to yourself, should I go to the bathroom now or try to see this patient? That's not conducive to wellness. And, you know, sometimes you can do what you can. I worked with my superiors to try to change my schedule. And then I realized I'm a human being. Sometimes I need to go to the bathroom. I need to find a job that allows me to do these things. So it seems basic, you guys, but this is the stuff that physicians really grapple with. And then, you know, taking care of my mind and spirit, therapy. Just coming back to that, there's a lot of stigma, especially amongst people of color, you know, around therapy. And I can't promise that every therapist will be culturally sensitive, but, you know, with my patients, I really, especially my patients of color who I truly believe could benefit, I really try to normalize it. If it feels appropriate, I do share that I've been in therapy. And sometimes I see this light bulb go on for them and they think, oh, well, she doesn't look like a hot mess, so maybe I should try this therapy thing. And I always tell them, just give it 3 times. It's kind of like dating. You know, I've broken up with therapists before if we didn't have a connection, and then found wonderful people. And so I'm just a huge fan of that. But I think you have to write these things down. You need to have a plan that you can activate when the going gets tough. It cannot be like, I'm spiraling now, what do I do? It has to be intentional. So, yep, I'll leave you guys with that.
Beautiful. Beautiful. It has to be intentional. You can't wait until you're spiraling. Thank you. Thank you so much for being with us today. And thank you for agreeing, in principle, at least, to come back again in the fall. And if not before, I wanted to announce that we will be having another webinar in September on moving through spiritual impasse to counter white supremacy, a conversation for white liberals. This will be led by the Reverend Dr. Rebecca Ann Parker, another leader with the Braxton Institute. The title of that webinar again is Moving Through Spiritual Impasse to Counter White Supremacy, a conversation for white liberals. So we have something for everyone. And please allow me to invite you, if you've enjoyed today's program, if you like the work that we're doing, give a little something to the Braxton Institute. We're an all-volunteer organization formed mostly from graduates of the College of William and Mary originally. And we really value the work that we do in the world and look forward to expanding it. So that's www.braxtoninstitute.org. And we'd be grateful to have your support in any measure. And we'd love your ideas and your feedback too. So please let us hear from you. And now, please go in peace and love until we meet again. Ashe. Thank you.